Hey everybody, welcome back to the shop. This is Todd with Industrial Comfort. If you've seen any of my past videos, when I'm making a dish, a tray, or a bowl, I'm always using my lathe. Not surprisingly, those pieces come out round. Now I've always wanted to make a rectangular dish like this one, and today I'm going to show you how. Now there are two things that you need to make a dish like this. One is a router jig that allows you to pass over the template in your workpiece. And I'm going to put a link in the description where I'm going to show you how to do this in a separate video. And then you need a dish bit. And I'll also put a link in the description showing you where to get one of those. With the two of these components, I'll show you how to make a beautiful dish like this. So let's get started. Now the first thing I'm going to do for this project is take this block of cherry and cut it into two pieces. Now I'm doing this for two reasons. The first of which is I'd like to remove this knot that I uncovered when I planed the wood. The second of which is I'm going to cut a strip from this block of walnut to create a nice stripe down what will eventually become this dish. I'll probably also glue in a piece of colored or dyed birch just to add a pop of color. So let's get the cutting done, we'll glue it up, and then we'll start routing. So I've got my 1/4 inch piece of plywood and I've cut some strips from some extra wood that I have laying around. Now this happens to be 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch. And you can use whatever size you want. And essentially what we're going to do is use some double-sided wood tape and we're just going to create a rectangle which is the same size as the dish we're looking to create. So I'm going to get this set up and then we're going to use this frame as a template to drill the holes that we're going to use to connect with a router bit. And I'll show you how we're going to get that done. All right, we're now going to bring this over to the drill press and we're going to drill a circle or a hole in each of the 4 corners. With this 2-inch Forstner bit mounted to the drill press, what I'm going to do is bracket it right into the corner here between these two pieces of wood and drill out a hole. Now I'm just going to do that for the other 3 corners. I'm over at the router table now, and I have a flush cut bit in the router. Now, a flush cut bit is very similar to this. Well, it's the same as this, except the bearing is actually on the top on this bit. Now, what this is going to allow us to do is use this frame that I've created as a reference to remove all the material beneath. Now, you want to be careful not to go into the corners, as that's going to disrupt the radius that we're going to be using to create the tray. Now, I want a larger radius because the bit we have that we're going to use to channel out all this material is 1 1/8 inches. So anything smaller than what we have here is not going to allow that bit to work. So let's go ahead and cut out the center material so that we can finish our template. We're done with the routing, and if I flip this over, you can see how well this came out in terms of the profile that we're going to be using to create the tray. Now, I've got a paint scraper, and I'm going to delicately pry these pieces of wood off, and then we're going to go ahead and probably give this a light sand. And then I'm going to show you how we're going to use this as the template to create the tray or a dish. The glue up is complete. Now it's time to plane this. Now you have to remember that a planer is nothing more than a thickness reducer. It doesn't actually create perfectly flat surfaces relative to one another. So I'm going to show you a few tricks to get a super uneven board like this perfectly level on the front and back. Now, to get a perfectly flat surface on both the front and back relative to one another, I'm going to be using a hot glue gun, which is about $2 on Amazon, and a pack of playing cards. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you know how this process works, but I'm going to show you how to do it now. Now there's one additional step I'm going to do before I mount it to the board, and that's taking my belt sander and just grinding the surface down a little bit to create a somewhat flatter surface. It just makes things easier to work with. It's not a requirement if you don't have a belt sander, but it will speed things up a little bit. Okay, here's where the card magic comes in. We're going to take this board that we're looking to create a parallel surface for, and we're going to put it on this reference board. Now this jig is nothing more than a flat piece of MDF, and I've screwed a piece of wood on the end just to keep things in place. Now, we're going to take the uneven board, put it on the flat piece of MDF. Now, if you notice, if I push any of these corners, you'll notice how this board rocks back and forth because it's very uneven. So the card trick is we're going to take these cards and we're going to stick them under the gaps to prevent any movement. That way, when we run through the surface planer, the planer will not push the board down and will create a flat surface on top, which will serve as our reference surface. We'll then remove it from this piece of flat MDF, flip it over, run it through the planer. And that's going to give us 2 perfectly parallel flat surfaces for this workpiece. With the dish blank now mounted to the jig with the playing cards in place, everything is flat and level, so let's start planing. Now that we have the flat surface on top, I'm going to use a paint scraper to gently pry up this board, which will flip over and then run through the planer. Okay, with the tray blank now flattened, we can put our template on top and start routing out the dish, right? Almost. If we use a regular plunge base, which we're going to have to with our router, we want to make sure that we have a surface whereby the base doesn't accidentally roll into the workpiece, which would ruin the piece or the tray that we're making. So what we're going to do is create another jig. And I realize that this project has been nothing but templates and jigs. The good news is once we create this jig, we'll be able to use it over and over again, similar to this one, if we choose to make a dish or a tray of the same size. Now, I'm going to show you how to make this in the next step, but essentially it's going to allow the base of the plunge router to mount to this piece of acrylic and slide over the workpiece. Now, the beauty of using acrylic is that we'll be able to see through it, so we'll be able to monitor our work, and it will prevent the plunge base from going into the workpiece. So let me show you how to make this. Once we're done with this jig, we'll be able to start routing. As you'll see, making one of these router jigs is a piece of cake, but there are several critical considerations that must be thought about as we do this project. The first of which is the material that we're going to use for the jig itself. You don't want anything too thin, and you don't want anything too thick either. So I've gone with a 1/4 inch, which is really the sweet spot for a jig like this. I'm also using acrylic, which is translucent. It comes with this paper backing, which I'll peel off at the end, but it will allow me to monitor my workpiece as I'm going through and performing the routing. If you choose to use plywood or another firm material, that's totally okay as well. Now, the other consideration we must think about is how we're going to attach this to our plunge router base. Now, we could remove this black plastic bushing and reuse the threaded holes here. I think that that's an extra step I don't really want to deal with, so I'm going to use some of these empty holes and back the bottom of this directly to the bottom of the plunge router base with some flathead screws and some wing nuts. That'll allow me to easily move this on and off. Now, I will lose a 1/4 inch of plunge capacity because I'm adding more material to the bottom of this base, which then brings up our second or our third consideration, which is ensuring that you have the right bushing. So a bushing is what allows us to ride along the edge of a template if we're using a template. Now, if this is not long enough, you're going to burn right through your template and ruin your material. So you got to make sure that you've got one that extends below the bottom of the base and obviously not too far so that it's pushing the router back up off the workpiece. Now, finally, you obviously want to make sure that your material is wide enough to cover the material that you're working with. So in this case, I've got about a 9.5 inch piece of wood that I'm going to be routing. 24 inch wide jig is going to be more than sufficient. Even at halfway at 12 inches, I'm going to have complete and total coverage. Now finally, this doesn't have to be super precise. Unlike many other projects where you want some really precise measurements and holes, as long as the holes match to the bottom of this, I wouldn't worry if it's exactly centered or not. We just want to make sure that we have enough coverage for our workpiece. So let's go ahead, we'll get this centered, we'll mark the hole, start drilling, and get this thing assembled. I've roughly centered the plunge base to this piece of acrylic, and I'm going to use a punch here to just gently dimple the material so that I know where to start drilling. I mentioned a minute ago that we're using a 1224 bolt that's 1.25 inches long. It's got a flat head that will go ahead and recess on the bottom of this plate. Now, this fits my router base. If you use something other than a Bosch, you'll just want to make sure that you get a bolt that fits the existing holes that you have in your plunge router. Now, I could have gone with a 1/4 inch, but I'm deciding to go with something slightly smaller just to accommodate any margin of error. I'm always using a 1/4 inch bit for the same purposes. So again, just make sure that you measure a bolt that's going to accommodate your base, and make sure that the length will accommodate as well. So I chose 1.25 inches because I'm mounting this to the bottom of my base without removing that black plastic glide. If I were to do that, I probably could have gone with a smaller base. So just think about that when you're deciding what bolt you're going to use. I'm now going to countersink the holes that I've drilled so that I can nest the heads of these bolts so that when I slide over the material, these bolt heads don't catch the template that we're using. Okay, for the next step, we're going to want to cut a hole that's going to match the hole in the bottom of this jig, the bottom of this plunge router base, so that obviously our router bits will go through. Jig. So we're just going to place this over the holes that we drilled and use a pencil to trace the hole that we're going to cut. The opening at the bottom of the plunger base is a little over 2 inches, so I have a 2-inch Forstner bit that I'm going to use to create that hole. Now that everything is cut, I'm going to go ahead and attach the router base. I've also decided to use a few washers between the wing nuts and the base here. There are many different ways that we can mount this blank to the workbench. Some people would use clamps. I'm actually going to try some double-sided wood tape. So I'm going to tape this blank down to the bench, and then I'm going to use the same double-sided wood tape to affix my template to the workpiece so we can start routing. I've got the new router jig that we just built, and I'm going to use it with a spiral cutting bit to run along the inside edge of this template to create the inner walls of this tray. I'm going to be going down in 1/8 inch increments, as you never want to go too deep with a router, as the bit will wander. It'll create very dirty cuts. You want to go nice and slow with these deep cuts. I'm back over at my drill press, and I'm going to use the same 2-inch Forstner bit I used earlier to hog out all this material in the tray. Now I could use a router and a router bit to do this, but it takes a long time and creates an insane amount of dust. So it'll be faster if I use this bit. Then once I'm done, I'll go back with a router tray bit and do all the cleanup work. Now I've set the drill press stop to slightly lower than this channel I just created, and then we'll remove the extra material again with that final bit. I'm back over to the workbench now. The material has been removed, so I'm now going to be using a dish bit to remove all the final material and really give that final finish. Now this dish bit, as you can see, or hopefully you can see, has a bearing on it. And the bearing is designed to run along the inner edge of the tray, and then it contours the bottom and removes any of the material with a 1/4 inch radius. So that'll give it a nice dish-like appearance. Now I've never done this before, so we're going to go ahead and see what happens. Now that we have the inside shape that we're looking for, I'm going to trim material from the edge to get the outside shape. Luckily, I happen to have these 2-inch diameter washers, and if you recall, we cut the template using a 2-inch Forstner bit. So I can use this washer to trace the same radius on the outside edge so that we'll get a consistently thick edge all the way around. You can also use a compass to follow the inside edge as well to get the same result. Now I'm going to cut the corners off using my bandsaw, and then we'll use the belt sander to finely tune the ends here. Before I give this dish its final sand and finish, I'm going to use a 3/8 inch roundover bit just to give it some soft edges around the bottom. Alright, you guys should know me well enough by now to know that True Oil is my go-to finish. So we're going to apply a couple of coats of this, and we'll be done. As you can see, this jig did a wonderful job, and this rectangular dish came out really cool. I realize there were a lot of jigs and templates in this video, but remember, you can use this stuff over and over again. If you found this video helpful, which I hope you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching.